My name is LJ Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and I'm delighted that you are with us today for a national conversation with Fareed Zakaria, the China Town Hall that will start at 7. In the meantime, we have the World Affairs Council program, which we're doing together with the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Thank you, University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And it is with our own expert here in Charlotte, Tate Nurkin. You might know Tate. He has spoken at the World Affairs Council events and other events in the region. He is amazing, and I'm so pleased and grateful that we have Tate with us today. And we'll talk a little bit about Tate in a little bit. Right now, I would like to just let you know that we will talk about the U.S. China relations. The annual China Town Hall connects leading China experts with Americans around the country for a national conversation on the implications of China's rise on U.S. China relations. The National Committee is proud to partner with a range of institutions and community groups, colleges, universities, trade and business associations, and World Affairs Councils to bring this important national conversation to local communities around America for the 15th consecutive year. And again, I would like to thank the China Town Hall partner today, University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Thank you. Thank you to the World Affairs Council's corporate sponsors with us today, Ambassador Sponsors, Bank of America, Nolan Health, Employees, Atrium Health, and University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and diplomats, Dixon, Hughes, Goodman, PDM, Rogers Builders, SPX, Flow. As the premier global education nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, the World Affairs Council has always sought to bring the world closer to you and to build a community of internationally informed and engaged citizens. Dialogue, knowledge, active participation, and an understanding of global issues are so vitally important for our country, for our society, for our democracy to flourish at all levels. And thank you all for participating and supporting the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. A couple of housekeeping details. Your microphone will be on mute and your camera will be turned off for the duration of the presentation. To submit a question at any time, please use the question and answer box on the Zoom toolbar, and you can see it circled in red here. And please note, this presentation will be recorded and sent to you through the World Affairs Council mailing list. So please do make sure that you're signed up to receive our emails to get a recording of this program today. Upcoming programs, excited to share with you that we will have the ambassador of Brazil to the United States live. This is a live program. It will be at the City Club here in Charlotte, and it will be about the importance of the Brazil-U.S. bilateral economic relationship luncheon, October 29th. Seats are still available. Please join us. November 2nd, we have the World Affairs Council Distinguished Speaker Series with Tara Kangarulu, who is the journalist, author, and humanitarian, and she will speak on the heartbeat of Iran, the real voices of a country and its people, and we will have her newest book for you to purchase if you are interested. On November 4th, we have, again, a live event with the CEO of Parsons Corporation, Chuck Harrington. He is actually now the executive chairman and CEO of Parsons Corporation, and he'll be with us on November 4 for luncheon. On December 2nd, excitement, World Quest International Trivia Competition. We're doing it again virtually. We did it once before virtually, and it was very successful. We invite you all to come and participate in the global knowledge game, World Quest International Trivia Competition. December 2nd. December 8th and 9th, we will have a private dinner and then an Ambassador Circle Series luncheon with His Excellency Taranjit Singh Sandhu, the Ambassador of India to the United States. So a lot of programs. We're excited, and we hope that you will all come and join us. If you're on social media, please do like, share, and follow the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. And now I would like to introduce to you Michael Hawley, a board member of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, former chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte from K&L Gates. Mike Hawley.
Thank you, Lubomir. I assume you can hear me? And
yes, we can.
Okay, great. Folks, we're in for a real treat tonight, hearing from Tate Nurkin. You'll find him most engaging and most interesting. And if you have questions for Tate, go ahead and put them in the chat box. I think is it the chat box that you want?
No, the question and answer box, not the chat box.
Okay, the Q&A box. Go ahead and put them in there, and we'll be tracking those while Tate's speaking and get everybody engaged if we can. So, you know, Tate has been described. I'm not going to go through his full biography. Many of you know Tate, and those that don't probably have read his resume, so I'm not going to repeat that. But he's been described as a thought leader, strategist, and analyst that's focused on three things. Number one, global geopolitical risk, particularly related to China. Number two, security and defense implications of emerging technologies. And three, the future of the global defense industry and its markets. Tate has 25 plus years of experience providing this type of analysis to public sector agencies, governmental agencies, nonprofits, and then as well the private sector. In his spare time, Tate's a prolific author and lecturer on these topics and the various elements of all of these topics that I mentioned, which range from artificial intelligence applications to trade and global relationships. Tate, just quick background on Tate. He got his undergraduate degree at Duke University and then got a master's in international affairs from the Sam Nunn School at Georgia Tech. He cut his teeth in the industry at the Janes Publications, and it's gone by several names over the years, but essentially for many of us, we remember the Janes military and defense publications. That's where Tate was for quite some time. He most recently started his own business, which he conducts under the name of OHN Consultants. And I guess there are two important things to remember about Tate. One is he's a world-renowned and sought-after expert in these areas that I mentioned. And number two, he has both roots and he resides right here with us in Charlotte, North Carolina, with his family, including Megan and their three boys, Jackson, Carter, and Grant. So I was on a call the other day, and Tate was on it as well, Zoom session. I mentioned that Tate was speaking today at this event, and I was trying to be amusing and said that Tate was going to be the opener for Fareed Zakaria. And Bill McNamara, who is on this call tonight as well and was on that earlier call the other day, he interrupted me and he said, I take issue with that. He said, as far as he's concerned, Fareed will be the closer for Tate. And so I now give you with great pleasure the big show, Tate Nurkin, who will talk for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions. Tate, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Mike. That is all way too kind and sets me up for abysmal failure now. So yeah, but I appreciate it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be part of this World Affairs Council community. I have been and still remain a big fan of everything that the World Affairs Council of Charlotte is doing to increase engagement with the critical global issues that are shaping the world in which we live. And to be fair, there are a very short list of issues more critical to our region, to our city, to our country, to the international system than the future of U.S. China relations. There are one or two, but again, it's a pretty short list. Anyway, I'm super excited, privileged, honored to have an opportunity to have this conversation here tonight. I want to start with a little bit of a caveat or disclaimer. I've been, as Mike mentioned, looking at U.S. China relations for almost a quarter of a century. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I've come to realize that, you know, this is at the center of a lot of people's hearts and minds, right? People are thinking about this issue in really fundamental ways. And There are so many people who have really interesting experiences, really talented people who come at the China-U.S. Relationship issue from very different angles that I find it really important to start by adding a little bit of detail to my background and my experiences, the ones I've had, and even those that I have not. Because as Mike mentioned, I've been working for a long time with the U.S. foreign policy, defense, and security community, and with those communities and allied and partner nations, including nations we'll talk about here today in the Indo-Pacific region. And that's what I do. I look at China's military modernization, defense acquisition and development programs, regional geopolitics and geoeconomics, China's demographics, some of its political systems. And that's where I'm going to keep my talk here today. I'm going to try and stay in my lane because they're, again, drifting out of one's lane on this topic can, well, I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has later, but don't be too offended if at some point I use the 3 most underrated words in the English language, which are I, don't, now. So this is a brief today that is largely going to be focused on doing 2 things. First, I don't know what Fareed Zakaria is going to say. I am 100% confident it will be profound, provocative, insightful, and really well done, but I'm not sure what his message is going to be. But what I wanted to do first and foremost was to talk about, maybe build a framework, hopefully one that's seen as relatively balanced, a framework of the tensions and perspectives of the US and China and other nations about US-China relationship and about something that we're now calling strategic competition, which seems to define that relationship currently and probably well into the future. I'll do that using an old trick. I'm going to have some straw man questions that I will answer. It's cheap, but it's effective. So I hope that goes over well. And then the second part of the brief, which will be hopefully pretty quick, I'm going to highlight some key issues that I'm keeping an eye on. This forum, 25, 30 minutes isn't really sufficient to go into everything that's going on or that is important in the US-China relationship. But there's some things that I'm tracking closely, and I just thought I'd bring those to your attention, although they may already well be. So, so let's start by lingering on this opening slide for a minute and talking about terminology. You'd be surprised at how important it is. The competition between the United States and China has been building and intensifying for several years. I think an important pivot point was the accession of President Xi Jinping in 2012. He has taken a considerably more assertive approach to pursuing China's stated interests. For example, the reclamation of subtidal features in the South China Sea, so the island building that occurred back in 2013 and continues still today, in order to claim territory within other countries' exclusive economic zones. Certainly the election of President Trump and the trade war and some of the things that came after COVID have contributed to the intensification of this competition. But by 2017 and 2018, the concept of US-China relations being marked primarily by competition had crystallized in 2 US government documents. The first is the National Security Strategy of 2017, and the second was the National Defense Strategy of 2018. And they introduced the concept of something known as great power competition, which is really what has dominated the conversation around US-China relations here in the States and in Europe and elsewhere ever since, especially after the trade war and fallout from both countries and globally from COVID-19. But you'll notice great power competition is not on this slide anywhere. Instead, we reference another term called strategic competition. Even since we named this brief, the US government has changed its lexicon around US-China competition from great power to strategic competition. I hope that's an interim term because I don't know what value it necessarily provides, but the Biden administration is currently revisiting the national security strategy and national defense strategy. They should be done in the next 12 to 18 months. Every administration does this. So hopefully there'll be, or likely there'll be some new terminology. President Biden has actually used a term I like a lot better, which is responsible competition, which I think gets at the point that one can be competitive without necessarily always being confrontational. So US-China relations are largely defined by competition, and this I think will be the case going on into the near to midterm future at least. But one thing, and actually next slide, Noah, one thing we don't often talk about is, outside of some policy circles, is what that competition is about. What are the stakes? What are we competing for, right? You do hear about geopolitical influence and economic advantage, both of which are exceedingly important. But I think there are more fundamental answers to this foundational question of what this competition is over. I sort of see the world in the midst of a time of geopolitical transition, from a moment of what the 2015 PLA book, The Science of Military Strategy, called unprecedented unipolarity, to, well, something else that hasn't quite fully been determined or crystallized. The US hopes to preserve the predominance of what is frequently referred to as the rules-based order, although that term is also coming up against some overuse challenges. And see China, as you can tell by this text box here on the right, this quote from Tony Blinken from earlier this year, as the preeminent threat to that order, which stressed free and open economic interchanges and free and open global commons. Again, that wasn't always lived up to perfectly, but this were the principles that the international system for the last 30 years have been based on, into which lots of countries have benefited, including China and the United States. So my perception is that the US and China are in competition to make the rules and set the norms for global trade, behaviors in the global commons. So think cyberspace, the oceans and space, and geopolitical interactions, and absolutely critically, the development and deployment of new technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution. So I get it, that's pretty esoteric, right? Making the rules of the game. China chafes at some of the rules that are currently out there, feels it constrains China unnecessarily. This is a country that's experiencing national rejuvenation and should be able to behave as a great power would in the international system. And the US sees those perceptions as being challenging the international system. So go to the next slide real quick. I'll give you a more tangible, less conceptual example of what making the rules really means. And this is admittedly super mundane, super unsexy, but also, again, really important. The formation of international technical and engineering standards. This is something that I've been watching pretty closely for a number of years and has really become a flashpoint in the US China competition. And frankly, US and China aren't the only two countries concerned about this. Technical standards are the common language for technology development and deployment. They're really important. And countries long before China in 2021 have been focused on standards development. It's not a new area of competition, but it is a centerpiece of this one, as China is developing a comprehensive national strategy known as China Standards 2035 that involves aligning domestic companies and working within the international organizations that set these standards, like the International Technology Standards Union, to ensure the standards that are set for emerging technologies like AI align with the way China develops its hardware and software. So you can imagine that setting the standards confers incredible economic advantage, right? If you're the one who is making the equipment that fits the standards, you have potentially a durable advantage against competitors. So that's why this has been important to the United States in the past, to Germany in the past within the EU context, and it's important to China now and to the US. But it also has, setting the standards also involves setting the norms of technology development and use. And I, again, will endeavor throughout this brief to be balanced. So if you hear me say something that seems like I'm criticizing either the US or China, just wait a little while. Here's something that I think is incredibly important as the technologies of the fourth IR, especially AI, come online. Indeed, there's already growing concern about China's leadership and norm establishment around AI, as you can see from this quote from Ryan Haas, who's actually a very credible, reasonably moderate US-based China analyst and former government national security community member. These are pics on the right of pictures I took of facial recognition surveillance systems being exported by Poly Group, which is a state-owned enterprise in the Chinese defense industrial base. They're on display at a defense exhibition I went to in 2019 in the Middle East. And we know that similar systems, surveillance systems, which capture data about individuals and allow for enhanced surveillance, have been exported to other countries in Africa and elsewhere and are in use in China. The point here is not that the US has never done anything wrong, but only that there is a growing and I think legitimate concern about the proliferation of these sort of tools of digital authoritarianism abroad and what that data capture and storage associated with these systems means, not just for the citizens of those countries, but for any citizens traveling, US citizens traveling abroad. Next slide. So that's making the rules. And The next question is looking at perspectives fueling this competition, right? So for those of you who are Seinfeld fans, this is where we get into the airing of grievances segment of the Festivus program, right? So in all seriousness, I recognize there's some sensitivity among observers that either think China is being unfairly maligned and those that believe it is engaged in malign behavior. This is more about offering the different perspectives of each country rather than trying to make a particularly strong argument. I certainly have a perspective and we can get into that, but it's but this is not my effort here. For the United States, there has been a growing amount of frustration and concern about a range of China's behaviors, notably trade practices that favor national champions and require endless compromises of U.S. companies regarding censorship. I don't know how many of you saw that LinkedIn has now left China, probably a bit too late, to be honest with you, after a censorship challenge. IP transfer, data storage, and the Chinese Communist Party oversight. IP theft and data harvesting are something that I'm starting to, or have been paying attention to. Lots of analysts are. As you can see from the slide, it's an area of growing focus around the world. A good example is this quote from Kim of the scale of the data harvesting. Certainly, lots of countries engage in cyber espionage, but the scale of what's going on and the sort of the harvesting of personally identifiable information from individuals in different countries around the world is of concern. And this concern is expressed by Kim McCallum, the head of MI5 in the UK, who, when speaking about cybersecurity and the information environment, noted that, yes, sure, the Russian intelligence services kind of are annoying. They provide bursts of bad weather, but China is changing the climate. So this is a pretty serious area that the US government is really beginning to focus on. The list goes on. You can see, you can read them all yourself. The contested territorial claims is something we'll come back to, as are most of these things, human rights concerns, and as I mentioned, the effort to overturn the rules-based order. Next slide. For its part, China disagrees with this assessment, noting that it's just a normal power, rising power doing normal rising power things and looking to maximize its influence and pursue critical national objectives. Key narratives include, it's a very dynamic society and economy. It has improved the economic conditions for hundreds of millions of people over the last 30 years, which is true. It has, although there are now, just as there are in the United States, there are real concerns about economic inequality. The US and West are throwing stones from their glass houses on foreign policy. The authoritarian system that China has built is more efficient and effective and less corrupting than liberal democracy. This is something that is at the heart of the Common Prosperity Initiative that is going on right now and has resulted in things like reducing the amount of time that kids play video games, like to 3 hours a week. And then efforts at national rejuvenation, which is at the core of President Xi's overall national initiative. And so you can see that there is also this perception that the real challenge here is that the United States is anxious about its relative decline and that it is picking a fight, that it is the one being assertive, and that it is trying to start a new Cold War. Now, I think there are holes in this argument, but it is certainly an argument that has become very prominent in China's political leadership. Next slide. So on that question of, is this a new Cold War? I wanted to take this question up as well, because I think it's sort of a, it's kind of a peripheral debate in my mind. I mean, is it a Cold War? No, it's not the Cold War. I think actually, more importantly, I think that construct is limiting and distracting. I appreciate the effort to draw historic lessons and maybe gain some insight about how to approach today's relationship with China. But the truth is that this is a very different sort of challenge to the one presented by the Soviets, and that there's a risk of being trapped by the Cold War analogy. That is, because this is a new Cold War, we should brush off the playbook for the old one and use that. And I think I would advise against that particular approach. The truth is there are real differences between China and the Soviet Union, the most important being China is so much more economically integrated into the global economy, right? I mean, China is every country in Asia's biggest trading partner, including Japan, Australia, India, the three countries that, along with the US, form the Quad, which is a defense and security sort of, not quite alliance, but arrangement designed to figure out ways to work together for a free and open Pacific. So even the countries that the US relies on for sort of regional deterrence and stability are countries that are over which there is some leverage that China has, and also some vulnerability to those countries, which we've seen in the recent trade spat with Australia. Very quietly, China has lifted its ban on Australian iron ore in the last few weeks in order to deal with the energy crisis and challenges in making steel. In addition, China is just a more dynamic place than the Soviet Union was. Even it is currently experiencing some, I think, significant social challenges and crackdown on the high-tech private sector and on certain social behaviors, as we mentioned. It's still a very dynamic society. Again, sort of fast-moving, and that some of that is taking an effect, but it is a more dynamic place than certainly the Soviet Union. I think also it's worth noting that this transition that we're talking about today is very different than the one that happened at the end of World War II, right? So that transition and that Cold War started based on, American ascendancy and confidence, on Russian endurance, right, after the end of the cataclysmic Second World War, and sort of decline and recovery in Europe and East Asia. This one is built on, a rising China with more confidence and more assertiveness, a distracted and introspective United States, and a world that is uncertain about where they can find safe harbor. So the conditions are very different, and we have to take that into account when the United States and China start making policies. They can't just simply look back at what the Soviet Union and the United States did. But there are some things about that analogy that I think we can extract. Certainly the need for a whole of government and society effort to raise the US game, to be more competitive in all of these different areas, I think is really important. This is clearly from an American perspective, but it's not just going to be defense. It's not just going to be high tech. It's not just going to be economics. All of those things have to be conjoined across government, which is really tough to do, but we've done it in the past. And I think the US is finally sort of waking up to the idea that its competitiveness has lagged in the last decade or so. It is long-term in nature. And the last thing I'd say is there is a need for habits of deconfliction. As we've seen recently, kind of the situation on the ground in East Asia or on the water, in East Asia or in the air, in the Western Pacific is pretty tense. And we have these habits of deconfliction with the Soviets, which I think would be very useful for us to develop with China. I'm not sure now is the time. I'm not sure there's a lot of interest in that right now, but I would think this would be very important. And what about collaboration? There's a lot of talk about collaboration, and I think collaboration would be great. It's very challenging in the current environment, is my take, but not necessarily impossible. Climate change, which was one of the couple issues I mentioned earlier that is more important than the U.S. China relationship to the future of our world and to the international system, that could be an area. I think there has been some unfortunate developments in the very recent past. Back at the beginning of September, John Kerry, who's the Biden administration's climate representative, met with Chinese representatives. And I think that meeting didn't go quite as John Kerry had planned. I think what had happened was that China, amidst some of these other big bilateral challenges, sort of linked climate change cooperation to critical concessions in bilateral areas like the status of Taiwan, which isn't going to happen. So hopefully the two sides will be able to find a way to come together at the upcoming climate summit. But this is one area that I do look at that could be, if we can get beyond some of the bilateral tension and start worrying about transnational issues, could be an interesting area for collaboration. Next slide. So it is also a broad, like I said, it's a wide-ranging competition. And so here are some categories. All of these are interlinked. It's very difficult to just separate economics and trade from geopolitics, from technology, from defense and security. But for the purposes of this slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of the different types of areas where this competition is playing out. I'm going to go into detail on a few of these lists, but just to give you an idea of some of the issues that I'm tracking, I would highlight delisting. Perhaps you've not, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is currently the US government is working to get Chinese companies that don't open their books the way that American companies do delisted from the American Stock Exchange. In other words, the idea is it introduces risk to investors in the American Stock Exchange, so we don't have the same transparency about Chinese companies as we do about American ones. That is set to, I think, come into place in 2024, so not so far down the road. And I think there are real economic impacts for everyone if there isn't a lot of attention paid to that. And so I'm starting to sink my teeth a little bit more into that. A lot to learn, but it's an interesting topic area. The other point I'd make on the slide is systems and narratives. Increasingly, the competition is being framed by both China and the United States as a battle of systems. In the United States, it's sort of democracy versus authoritarianism. In China, it's a similar slant. It's sort of socialism with Chinese characteristics that is, superior and more efficient, and that the world needs to be a permissive place for that system to develop and thrive. So look at these types of statements, that type of rhetoric that is focusing on ideology, because once you get into ideology and systems, which may be the right way to go, that is certainly an area that is increasingly conspicuous. But I think the off-ramps become a little bit further spaced out when you start talking about something as core to political survivability as ideology. Next slide. So a couple of the things that I'm looking at, the Belt and Road Initiative, probably familiar to many of you on this call. I put it on the slide and sort of highlight it because it cuts across all of those categories that we just had. This is one initiative that certainly reflects economic and trade. It's Chinese investment in physical and digital infrastructure really almost throughout the world, including in European states, some of which are part of NATO, like Greece. It is refocusing a little bit after some pushback late in the last decade that was related to some of the poor quality of the actual construction, some corruption issues, debt leverage that China gained over countries that maybe weren't going to be able to pay it back. But China has sought very much to change the narrative about BRI, some of the behaviors, but still, I think the narrative has changed a good bit. This is a critical initiative to which President Xi has attached his reputation, his name. He's really very strongly behind it. Over $1 trillion already spent on infrastructure development around the world. And again, a lot of these countries, they're getting money from China, but not really anywhere else. The US has something called the Blue Dot Initiative, which has about $50 billion in investment. I mean, that's not even remotely the same scale. So these countries, I think, are in many cases excited to get the investment, even if some of them have over time have run into trouble. It is definitely expanding China's global interest and influence, and that is now being called out and having knock-on effects for China's military modernization, which in the 2019 Defense White Paper explicitly called out the need to defend China's overseas interests. Now China has its first military base in Djibouti, which is about 6 miles away from the US military base in Djibouti. So, next slide. COVID-19 and vaccine diplomacy, neither country really shined at the start of COVID-19 pandemic. And I think both have tried to do things to reverse that narrative. China has been especially aggressive and has become the global leader in the provision of COVID-19 vaccines around the world. Over 1 billion have been provided to 109 countries. About 50 million of those have been donated. The rest have been purchased. And these are tied to both humanitarian and to geopolitical interests. They have enabled manufacturing in some countries like the UAE, who are a regional ally that China is working with on defense and security, as well as economic issues, and is also a partner of the United States in the region. And they've engaged some Latin American countries, both to distribute the vaccine and also at times have denied the vaccine. And the reason that's relevant is because about half the countries that recognize the sovereignty of Taiwan are in Latin America, including, I believe it was Belize that was denied the vaccine. So again, certainly a humanitarian component to this, but it's hard to ignore that there's some geopolitical components to it as well. There are some efficacy concerns. The Chinese vaccine Sinovac is only about 51% effective, but 51% effective is better than zero. Others have been slow to respond. The US has distributed about 150 million vaccines. The EU has about 700 million. They're distributing to basically the same countries as China, a lot of overlap. Again, most of those are on the Belt and Road, or involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, seeing the overlap between these geopolitical initiatives. Next slide. Technology, trade, and data. Man, the one of my favorite quotes from the uncomfortableness of the trade war was, "This isn't a trade war, it's a technology war." And I think that was right. Technology is at the center of the U.S. China competition. Some current focus areas, you can see the technologies. None of those would be a surprise to anyone who's following kind of the fourth industrial revolution and where investment is going. But what I think is kind of a surprise, or maybe not a surprise, but is underplayed, is the talent component of that competition. You can see here comments made by Xi Jinping earlier this year that it's important for a global scientific and technological superpower, to which China certainly aspires, must be able to attract, retain, and make good use of talent on a global scale. There is a talent shortage to drive the development of all of these different technologies, and China, the United States, Europe, every country in the world is trying to find ways to attract, retain, and make good use. I'll pass over in the interest of time the agility prime reference, but it's a fun one. We may come back to it if we are short of questions. Next slide. Regional and global responses for both the United States and China. Engagement in the world is really important. That's part of this competition. There's narrative building. You know, China, one of its, I think, core focus areas for its strategy in this competition is to create an environment that is at very least not hostile to its system and to its behaviors. It has had mixed success in doing that. Of course, allies and partners are really important for the U.S. response as well. They've gained importance under the Biden administration. And there have been mixed responses so far to China's behaviors and also to the U.S. And you know, I referenced this picture of these two covers of this. This is a report called The Defense of Japan, which is released every summer by the Japanese Ministry of Defense. The one on the left is the cover from 2020, and it's in line with all the other ones, all the 2019, 2018. You know, they're all very similar. They're all, you know, non-threatening. Those are cherry blossoms and a mountain. It's a great document, and it's a very pacifist sort of cover. The one for 2021 is different. I don't know if you can tell the difference. Just kidding. It's obviously much more militaristic, which is something that you don't often see from Japan. So clearly concern in Japan, and I think that is shared across Australia, certainly India, and those 4 countries make up the Quad, which I referenced. The UK is trying to start the D10 in conjunction with the United States, the 10 leading democracies, to sort of push back against the China's sort of cyber activities and data harvesting and control of standards around AI and network connectivity. So there is some pushback. There's also an attempt to balance strategic concern with economic engagement. The EU have agreed to this comprehensive investment deal with China back in January, which again, within the context of saying, yeah, we get it. We know China is behaving in some ways that we don't agree with, but they're a huge market and they are a critical international actor. So we're going to engage with them. That deal is now on hold. So maybe a little cautionary tale, because the EU levied what were, in comparison to the United States and some others, very moderate sanctions against 4 members of the Chinese government related to the Uyghur detention in Western China. And the response from China was very, very strong, and it caused the EU to kind of take a step back. It may still go forward, but it probably won't be for till 2023, at least a year after it was expected to go into place. But then others are embracing engagement. Sure, why not? Again, if you know, as you see from the quote from the Vice President of Zimbabwe, these vaccines that China has provided are critical to their economic and social recovery, and they're very grateful for it. Just as some countries along the BRI are grateful for the investment as well. So I think the US have been challenged by their slowness to complete a vision, and China is sort of meeting with mixed responses on the global stage. I do want to just pause real quick, and then I think maybe do one other slide after this and answer some questions. But it's important to understand what's going on inside each country. We talk a lot about the external facing, but these competitions are two-level games, right? There's a lot going on domestically in each country that is important, that can either enhance competitive instincts or dampen them. And I think certainly, the challenges that we've had, political and social challenges and division, are taking a toll, not just on our ability to be competitive, but also the countries around the world see that, and it's a foreign policy. It's to our foreign policy detriment that we, as a country that espouses democracy around the world, has struggled a little bit. It doesn't mean that our democracy is gone or that we can't still have similar foreign policy objectives and approaches. But as Tony Blinken said earlier this year, there is no question that our democracy is fragile. I wouldn't disagree with that. So on China's side, it's been a very impressive rise, but there are these lists of different challenges that are ongoing. Some of them might be temporary, but I think they're all things that are affecting China's timeline in terms of some of its thinking about about its foreign policy. Next slide. Yeah, we can actually, why don't we go to the next one, because I feel like the next one is actually a little bit more important and a good place to finish, which is redefining conflict. One of the things that I look at a lot is how conflict is changing, and technology is enabling that. So we now see things, a a lot more actions that is conflict, but it's below the threshold of kinetic conflict, of traditional military conflict. And that has been going on in the Western Pacific and elsewhere for a very long time, and it is really ramped up here in the last 2 years. And I'll highlight the intrusion operations. Maybe some of you saw that 149 planes flew into Taiwan's air defense identification zone from 1 through 4 October. This was a massive intrusion. I mean, this has been going on for years, and there are literally hundreds, sometimes thousands of intrusions a year. But this was a bold move. And again, these are the types of things designed to just sort of push the narrative and the boundary, both literally and figuratively, and not necessarily cause a military confrontation, but establish sort of the new procedures and claim sovereignty over Taiwan. So I know we're really over time. I probably overstuffed the brief, but I think this is probably a good place to stop and open it up.
Thank you, Tate. Brilliant as always, most intriguing and entertaining and informative. So thank you. We've got a bunch of questions. We'll cover as many as we can. One that I was hoping would come up is something that was done by the World Affairs Council back in 2017. Tate, I think you were actually there. Dr. Graham Allison from Harvard spoke to us. Graham Allison grew up in Charlotte, but he's been advising presidents and administrations since the Kennedy times. And so his book was Destined for War, How to Avoid Thucydides' Trap. And Thucydides' Trap is that conflict becomes inevitable between rising powers and falling powers at a critical time in that transition. And I've read some things lately, Tate, that talk about Thucydides' trap, but in the opposite direction than the one we typically think of, with China potentially becoming a failing country in some respects and not be the rising star that we view it to be, and that the United States is far from a declining power. I mean, how do you see that dynamic? And maybe we can combine one other question with that. What are your impressions about Xi Jinping as a person? Is this how do you compare and contrast him with Vladimir Putin, for instance, or other authoritarians? And does it play into this analysis that Graham Allison put forward?
Sure. Well, it's a lot of questions. So let me try and unpack it or have a think about how I might. First of all, leadership matters, right? Leaders definitely matter. And I think one of the things that I sort of glossed over in that last slide was the idea that next year, 2022, the general meeting will happen, and Xi Jinping has positioned himself for a third 5-year term. And he has already sort of become, cult of personality is a very sensitive term in China. It was something that Mao kind of preached again, and everyone since has certainly preached again. And so, but he has definitely integrated himself into all aspects of Chinese life. His Xi's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristic is now being taught in Chinese grammar schools. So he is attempting to further ingratiate himself into Chinese sort of historical political legacy, and as leader of the future, at least out, I think, probably to the end of this decade or perhaps the middle of the next. So yeah, he has been much more assertive than previous leaders, and I think that has played into, and much more risk tolerant, which again goes to your question about war. Risk tolerance isn't always a bad thing or destabilizing, but I think we've seen that it's starting to raise concerns in places like Japan that, like, again, not particularly militaristic society that is, and I speak a lot to the Japanese military, and their concern is heightened. So leadership matters. Leadership matters here. It matters there. It probably matters maybe a little bit more in China, just because of the nature of the system, and there are fewer breaks. Not none, by the way, but fewer. As far as Thucydides' trap, I don't love terms like inevitable or impossible or always and never national affairs, just because we've seen so many times that the straight line projections don't come true, and crazy things happen. Even crazy good things happen where countries don't go to war, even when that dynamic exists. I am much more concerned currently about miscalculation, which is why I talked about habits of deconfliction, but also, look, I think the thing that's going to happen in Taiwan is not an invasion. China is not militarily credible to invade Taiwan now. She has actually said we need to speed up our planning, which was usually typically focused on 2035 as the date where they would have the capability to invade Taiwan, to 2027 or somewhere in the middle of this decade. So, but it's this constant pressing and wearing down of the will of different militaries and societies, and also wearing down their operational capacity. I'll tell you that Japan has the same problem that Taiwan does. In other words, these incursion operations in which there are probably 700, 800, 900 a year. And every time there's a Chinese jet that flies into Japan's ADIZ, 4 F-15s have to go chase it out. And that just wears down the operational readiness of those systems, those platforms and systems. So I worry about that. And I worry about domestic situation in China that speeds up the timeline even further, or causes a decision to push the luck a little bit further. And the U.S. is not immune to that, by the way. But those are kind of the things that are on my mind when it comes to conflict in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Tate. And that question on Thucydides' trap came from Stephen Phillips. So thank you, Stephen.
It's a great question. It's really great
question. What's that?
It's a great question.
Yeah,
it really is.
And Tate, just putting a couple other questions together. You talked about the Belt and Road Initiative. There's more than economics going on there. And I guess the tenor of the questions is, what is the end game of China with that initiative, especially given the withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan and its the Belt and Road Initiative's effects on Eastern Europe, Central Asia? What's the game there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is to further deepen the economic and therefore geopolitical relationships with these countries, to convince some of them, especially those that have relationships with the United States, to become strategically independent, which is what China has tried to do with the EU, try to convince the EU to say, look, we know you've been friends with these guys for a long time, but look at them. What have they done for you lately? We're here. We want to do this deal. So I think it is, and ultimately to potentially influence their decision-making on key issues, and to make, as I said, the world a more permissive place for Chinese influence and for Chinese systems. So, I think it all makes sense, actually. And if you were, I'm not going to say it's an analog to the Marshall Plan, but I am saying that there are instances of investment in countries that were in need of that investment as a geopolitical tool to help expand influence and to get countries to be more open to the idea of working with you on other issues. And I think that's what's at play here as well. And as far as Afghanistan, just very quickly, I know that the one of the narratives has been, boy, China is really celebrating the U.S. getting out of Afghanistan, and without a doubt, it was a really bad look. That's not the point to go into that. But I will tell you that I don't think China is celebrating the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan. That is not salutary development for China. I think it was very much hoping the U.S. would stay and at least create some sort of semblance of a coalition government, although who knows how long that would have lasted. So I think that causes some challenges, especially given that Afghanistan borders a part of China that has been a source of I would say objection to this Chinese Communist Party. So I think there's more complex narratives around the Afghanistan and China.
So Tate, there's a bunch of questions around what it is that we are doing as individual Americans to help or hinder this responsible competition that you talked about. And people mentioned, we are just crazy about buying everything that is produced in China. We essentially have outsourced much of our economy, it seems, to other places. And we also are having some difficulty, as John Gallus, who's on this call, will confirm that, our education system, we're not doing ourselves any favors in how we're going about training and educating generations of people here to put us in position to make some progress with this responsible competition. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's, again, these are great questions. So I think one thing, and I'll start here because I think it's probably, first of all, we have to, as Americans, I would say, be open to the fact that, this is a competition against the Chinese government and not the Chinese people, and certainly not Chinese Americans, as Chris Wray, the head of the FBI, said. So I think sometimes China does get mileage out of the fact that it has been, especially for Chinese citizens who come to the United States to study, and who we have relied on in some ways for our innovation efforts. Again, some of that has been also, they've also sometimes been involved in espionage, but the idea that we are a society that welcomes folks and doesn't discriminate against them is one thing, because there is mileage that has been gained out of that in the competition. But I think probably more to the point of the question, which is what can we do? Yeah, I mean, education is critical. Although I couldn't agree more. We certainly, that talent gap and shortage, there's no reason why the United States shouldn't be at the top of the list, right? And we have, given our history and the innovation ecosystem we have here, but we somehow seem to fall a little short, or have done recently. One other thing that I think is maybe less at an individual level, but this is something maybe to think about. On that one slide, I had the picture of this logo called Agility Prime. And that's actually a U.S. Air Force program that is designed to build electric, uncrewed, vertical takeoff and landing like cargo aircraft. This is an area that a lot of people think is going to be a real area of technological capability competition, not just for the military, but for the industry as well. And this is one of the rare instances where government is actually leading the way in engaging the non-traditional defense industrial base, the high-tech startups, getting them involved, not just in selling to the commercial market, but working with government in a productive way that benefits everybody to leverage all of this stuff, this incredible high-tech industry and other industries we have here that I think are not being fully dedicated to this, to competing not just against China, but in the world.
Thank you, Tate. And this is a question that you undoubtedly cannot answer in the 2 to 3 minutes, which we're going to allocate to you before we turn it back over to Lubomir. But, this is something that a lot of us have been thinking about. And this competition is much more than just economic. There are governance systems, as you pointed out in your outline, that are in play here. And can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what have we given up trying to spread democracy to the entire planet? Are Chinese coming our way with a new system of governance that basically does what we do better? Where do you stand there?
Oh, I mean, I think it is a big part of the competition. And I would, if anybody's looking for something to read on this, I have a colleague at the Atlantic Council named Matt Kronig, who's written a book on it and has written extensively on, and a lot of people are writing on it, but Matt's a friend, so I refer him. Yes. So I don't know about spreading democracy as our huge major foreign policy goal. I think we want to reinforce it, it feels to me, more than we want to be evangelists for it, because it is under threat in a number of places around the world, including, one could argue, here in the Western Hemisphere and in Western Europe. So the idea that we are able to reinforce it, to reinforce the institutions that are critical to self-governance and to responsible exercise of liberty and freedom, those are things that I think are at the center of the Biden foreign policy and should be for whoever later this decade and whenever going forward. I think China's brand of government, this sort of, although it is becoming much more socialist even this year than it previously was, relying on sort of a capitalist economy and an authoritarian regime, has appeal to some countries, and especially countries that maybe have weaker leadership and can leverage those tools I talked about earlier that China is putting to good use in its own country to surveil its citizens and keep the social order, and also to make sure that there's less free access to the internet, less free access to information. So that's the system challenge. It's between the sort of open society, which are vulnerable and messy and all of that, and that's true, and a much sort of, at least on the outside, much more efficient, controlled sort of government that achieves that through restrictions of freedoms that I think we in this country tend to value. So I don't know, I think it is a big part of the competition. I'm not going to say it's the only part, but it's become more prominent over the last few years. And I think that's one of the knock-on effects of this current administration in China.
Spectacular stuff, Tate. Terrific as always. As I turn it back to Lubomir, I wanted to give a shout out to Frank Kiker, who I see is on this call. Frank's a long-time, decades-long supporter of the World Affairs Council. Frank, hope you're doing well. Lubomir, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Tate. Thank you, Mike. I would also like to give a shout out to Frank, but also to our board members who are here with us tonight and who help us lead the World Affairs Council and have programs like this. Before we move on to Fareed Zakaria, I'm sorry, I would like to give a moment to our chairman of the board, Wayne Cooper, to say a couple of words. Wayne?
Thank you, LJ, and gosh, thank you, Tate. What a great subject and so well presented. I remember when you were out here at the summer party here a couple of years ago, and we got so many great comments on your presentation, and I'm sure we will again today. I just want to remind everybody that if you're not a member, please become one. If you are a member, think about increasing your membership, because that's what in the world drives this organization is the membership. And this allows LJ and the excellent staff to put on such a great, bring us these great programs. So I guess, LJ, I'll turn it back over to you, and then we move into the
Fareed Zakaria. And again,
closing.
I believe that what we heard from Tate is actually, as Mike said, the better part of this program. But I invite you to come to the second part of the program. And talking of staff, let me thank Noah, Charlotte, and Mary for putting this thing together. It is a real pleasure to work with this team. And once again, I hope to see you at our live events, City Club, with the Ambassador of Brazil on October 29th. We have a reception at 11:30 and luncheon at 12 o'clock. Having said that, Tate, thank you so very much for being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Mike, wonderful job as always. Please stay on. Noah will connect us now to the national program with Fareed Zakaria. Thank you.
Thanks, Tate.
Thanks, Mike. Great to see everybody.